Welcome back to another episode of From the Ground Up. My name is Margaret Stouter. I'm the registrar and site archaeologist here at Fort Ticonderoga. For this episode, we are looking at locks. Now, locks have been used for thousands and thousands of years in places like ancient Rome and ancient Egypt, and they were used on doors and walls, city gates to keep people within safe. They were also used eventually on things like boxes and trunks so that personal property or government possessions could be kept away safe as well. So things like money and documents and things like expensive spices. And going forward in time, especially in medieval Europe, you see locks becoming incredibly elaborate and decorative. So now they're being sought after for their artistry, not so much their functionality. Now here in the 18th century at Fort Ticonderoga, in a military context, our locks are incredibly functional. They're being used on doors to keep the barracks and rooms safe where the Army's property is being kept. We also have padlocks, so padlocks being introduced earlier, but now allowing for people to lock things that might need to move and travel, so they're not sedentary like your locks that are going into your doors. And all of the locks that we have in front of me here are archaeological locks. So these were all found here on the property, mostly during the restoration of the fort in the early 20th century. Now, to start off with, we're going to look at some of our locks that would have been used on doors, both exterior doors and interior doors. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. And what's interesting with a lot of the parts within both the door type locks and our padlocks is that they're using similar parts, but the scale is just getting bigger or larger depending on the sort of shell within which these pieces, these mechanisms are being put in. Now, to start off with, we're going to look at some of our stock locks. And you have plain stock locks, which were originally locks that were being really placed into a wood piece. So you would have just the different mechanisms, different pieces that were being put into a wood stock. But what we find a lot of here archaeologically is plate stock locks. So all of the mechanisms being put onto a piece of plate, of iron plate. And to start off with, I have this one here. We would have the rectangular piece of plate that would then be shaped into an L. So there's this sort of side that comes over like a flange. And you have your bolt, which is being put across the top here. And it would come out through that bent over side. And that is the section that is between the door and the jamb. So the piece of the bolt is going through and locking into the jamb of your door to lock your door. And what's really great about this archaeological remnant is actually that in this case the bolt hasn't sort of corroded to the back plate, so you can see how it would have moved through and the bolt would have come through and locked into the jamb of the door. Now this is missing some of its parts, but this does have the bolt with some of those sort of keyed pieces, those little sections that have been removed for the key to help turn it. We also have a collar on here, and it would have had a ward, which was a piece that goes on the front, and that also, depending on the different parts of your key, the little sections of it would fit into these different grooves and help shift the bolt over. So this is a really great example that has that bolt that's been left in it. Some of our pieces also have springs and tumblers attached to them as well, which were more mechanisms to help turn the bolt, have the key really trigger the spring and the tumbler to push over the bolt into the wall. And in this instance, we have a really big spring that's been attached here with its tumbler. And you can see for this one, this would have been most likely for an exterior door. And again, that nice thick bolt that goes across and would have gone right into the door frame. So these aren't fully covered. These are just one side, and they would have had that L shape and then been placed into the door frame itself. We have some that are missing more of their pieces in terms of the bolts, but we do have in this case the ward piece, or this front piece, which was another section for the key to turn through. And what was also great about these sections here was that they protected a lot of the mechanisms within inside, but also were a sort of extra guard for the key going in. So it helped make sure the key was going in straight if you had the correct key. With these boxes too, the keys were being made of the correct length. So your key would hit the back usually of your lock box here. So you'd know you had the right key. But the key would come in, and the different grooves on the key would match the length or depth of the ward, and then it would be hitting the springs and the tumblers that were on these locks and helping shift over that bolt. Now, some of the different locks that we have also would have had sliding bolts on them as well. This is a fragment of a sliding bolt. Some of them would have been attached just as an extra lock across. Some of them would have been triggered by that bolt action going on as well. So this is a nice sort of thick piece of bolt that would have been used to help keep the door shut. Now, these are all pieces that would have just had that one section of plate. And you can see with them where they have their little holes that would have been then had pegs, or not pegs, excuse me, nails or brackets to nail it to into the piece of door wood. But we do have this box lock here, which is amazingly preserved. It has a whole sort of encased metal iron sheet metal here for the box. So it's not just one section of plate with the little L shape that comes over, but in fact a whole, all sides of it box. You can see where it has the keyhole on the front, and like some of, unlike some of our other examples that I've showed, where you would have just had the lock on one side, this guy actually has locks on both, keyholes on both sides, so that you could lock it from both sides of the door. Now we can actually remove here the front of our box lock. And in this case, our bolt, which would have gone through the side, and you can see on this example where the bolt would have gone through, is missing. And so is the spring and tumbler, but we do have the front ward pieces here that are still in place. So again, help guiding the key in, being the right depth of key, and then fitting into any grooves that were inside on the interior, and helping then turn all the mechanisms to slide that bolt across. So really remarkable that in this case we have all the pieces for this one. Now we also have a few of the interior pieces, and these might have come then from these plate stock locks. They might have also come from the plain stock locks, which didn't have all the casings but were just being set into the wood. And here's this very large bolt that we have, and you can see some of the little teeth that come off the edge there, and that's what would have helped turn this then into, whether it was a door frame or it could have been set into some type of box as well, but it has also the little grooves on top. So this is missing then the springs and tumblers that would have come with it, but just amazing in terms of the size, how big this is. And then for comparison, we have this little section here, which looks like it probably came from a trunk. It's flat, it's missing some of what would have been sides that would have fit into a larger door if it was meant for a door, but with the little holes here, it looks like this was probably just set into something, so likely a trunk. But in comparison, our large bolt here, and then the smaller, much smaller scale bolt here, doing the same thing. So this, in this case, would have had a piece that came down and locked here. So if you did have a trunk or some type of box that had a piece that came down in the front and then would have flipped up, the bolt would have gone and slid into the little piece that then went through this channel, this hole right here. So a much smaller scaled bolt on this one. Now we also have a tumbler here. So this is this little P-shaped, and it has a little section that comes out here. And this is what, when the key turned inside your stock plates here, would have helped swing up and then help swing this bolt over. And they also could have had their springs attached to them. So we also have these individually as well. Now we have keys that would have set into some of these guys, and we don't have, of course, know which ones would have matched, but it gives us an idea of some of the different sort of styles and cuts that would have come into some of the different mechanical pieces. You can see here that this key has a turn to it, so this would have specifically turned into a ward or a collar that sometimes could be on the interior of your stock plates, or just any parts of your lock. And then this could have had a matching one or had some different type of configuration, so specific to the lock that it was opening. This one doesn't have a cut through the middle. This had little rivets in the side instead. So again, however the locksmith was making these locks, the key was going to match the interior. And those are for bigger locks, and we also have smaller keys as well. So these would have been maybe for trunks or personal boxes that people had on a much smaller scale. Now we have padlocks here in the collection as well, and as I said, these were more for things that maybe were moving, or you wanted to be able to take your lock off to take things out of a box or a trunk. You could also use these on doors as well. And there's some different styles that we have for our padlocks here. Padlocks, the shapes of them through the medieval period, you see a lot of triangular padlock shapes, a lot of ball-shaped ones, so very rounded. And as you get into the 18th century, you start getting these more bag or shield-shaped padlocks, first starting off more squat and then becoming longer and taller as the 18th century goes on. So for example here, this is one of our bag padlocks, and you do see some decorations on them sometimes. You can see it a little bit more on the conserved one that I'll show you in a moment. But this one being a little bit more squat, it has this front sort of swinging section that would close up and cover the keyhole, so you wouldn't get, especially if they were on a door or going to be open to the elements, you wouldn't be getting any dirt and grime in there to keep it nice and closed. It has this bail or hasp piece that is on a pivot, so this section comes backwards. Once you're able to open it, you can then attach this to whatever you're looking to lock, whether it be a door or a trunk, and then it closes over again and you would lock it. So this being a unconserved piece that we have here, so all the mechanisms have been corroded inside, but we do have an example I'll show in a minute where we can see those mechanisms. But this being another one of those bag-shaped padlocks that has been conserved, and this example is great because you can see the little decorative X's and lines that they would sometimes put on these little closing pieces. So what's really great about padlocks is that they come similar to the stock locks in different shapes and sizes. So those being more of a bag shape, this starting to become a little bit different form as they're becoming longer and more circular, and you can see there are some decorative lines on this one as well, and the keyhole that would have had a certain depth of key so that you could unlock this lock. So we also have this amazing heart-shaped lock as well, and most likely French. And through our archival documentation, we do know from the 1757 inventory from the Magasin du Roi that they had 12 padlocks in stores. And in this case, this heart-shaped padlock, being a little bit on the bigger side, but having been conserved, we can see the mechanisms inside to show how the padlock would have worked. So the front here has all of the mechanisms of the lock, and there's a little bit of a collar. The key would have had that sort of similar sort of S curve shape as we see on this key here to fit through the bottom section of the keyhole. And that would have come up possibly around parts of the collar. You have this little plate here on the front that would then help trigger the spring to push over the bolt. And once the bolt had been either released to lock it or then unreleased to unlock this lock, the section here, the bolt would have gone into the little rivet on this bail. And then once that was released, this could then slide up, and you'd be able to release this from whatever clasp it was on, again, whether it was a door or on some other type of box. But this just being an amazing, beautiful example of these heart-shaped locks that were popular in the 18th century. And again, in this context, most possibly French, but just absolutely remarkable that all the pieces like this have just stayed. Now, one other type of lock type that we see in the 18th century are these half-heart-shaped locks. And we have different sizes here. Both have been conserved. So this is a slightly larger one, and you can see why it was called a half-heart shape, because it looks like half of a heart. And unlike our other padlocks that we have here, where the bail or the hasp is on a pivot, so it's not releasing fully from the face, the section of lock, but has a little pin in it to keep it attached. These actually had their hasp, their tops, fully release. And we had these two sections that come up from the top that would have just sort of safeguarded the holes a little bit. And unlike these where it's being, the top of it, the bail, the hasp is being locked into a bolt, these were most likely some type of like L-shaped spring or V-shaped spring. So they would get smaller or larger depending on if they had been triggered by the key. Once they've been put into the lock, they would then sort of release themselves and be locked in place, and the key, when it would be turned, would compress them and then it would pop out. So the whole top half of this is missing in this case, but would have been released. And it has the wonderful keyhole there that you can see that has been conserved and preserved in place there. And in this case, we have these two vertical strips as well that go back on both the front and back, so most likely mid-century, 18th century lock type, or possibly earlier. And again, different scale sizes. We have a sort of medium-shaped one here, and then a very little itty-bitty small one, which is just amazing. And you can see here that the top section has been kept in place, and you just wonder what they were using this very little small lock for. Now, the other heart shape example that we have are from escutcheon plates, and these could have been used both in door handles as a sort of decoration behind the door handle, but you also see them in lock contexts as well, where there'd be a keyhole, and it could have been with a stock lock, or perhaps on the front of the door where the key goes through, and would have just been an extra decoration in the front of your lock area. So these are just a few of our different types of locks that we have here in the collection. They are all available on the Ticonderoga online collections database for you to see. There's additional photos, and you can see some details about them. I thank you for joining me for another episode of From the Ground Up, and if you're interested in seeing what some of our other upcoming digital programs are, you can visit our website at www.fortticonderoga.org, and you can also check us out on social media through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you next time.